This is where I get my optimism a little bit. If it goes exactly as you're saying, like that's why I say like grounding themselves in a legacy studio, because it's like they have the streaming, but if they can add to that with this other model and use both, I mean, that everybody should win in that situation, in theory.
In this episode of Inside the Art House, we step outside our usual filmmaker deep dives to cover a seismic moment in Hollywood, one that could reshape the industry from the ground up. Warner Brothers, one of cinema's oldest and most influential studios, is officially up for sale. After weighing multiple offers, the company initially leaned towards a deal with Netflix, which would fold a century of studio legacy into a global streaming platform.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
Within days, Paramount, backed by tech titan Larry Ellison, fired back with a surprise counteroffer, turning the situation into a full-blown bidding war. Both proposals will face significant regulatory challenges, so none of this is a done deal. But the very fact that something as monumental as this is happening does have something to say about the evolving media environment we live in. And even if art house cinema is a small niche within the larger ecosystem, it will still feel the impacts of this event. To help us make sense of the current events, we turn to previous guest Ross Melnick, a professor of film and media studies at UC Santa Barbara, and we're also joined by author Chris Yogerst, writer of The Warner Brothers, a history of the company that is the subject of this bidding war. This conversation was recorded on the evening of December 10th, and events, no doubt, will continue to shift. But our goal is to offer context, history, and perspective on what's really at stake. So, please, join us as we discuss how consolidation within the industry might impact the movies you love and the places you get to see them. On Inside the Art House, starting now.
Hi, my name is Greg Lemley.
And I'm Raphael Sparge.
And welcome to another episode of Inside the Art House. We're joined today by our old friend, Ross Melnick. Welcome back to Inside the Art House, Ross.
Thank
Ross
you for
is the professor. Yeah, our pleasure. Ross is a professor of film and media studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and also an author. And we're here today with something a little different. We're having a discussion about a current event. We're recording this on December 10th. And by the time this is edited and put out for publication, a lot could change. The event is the announcement that Warner Brothers is being sold to Netflix and everything that's come up around that. But to have a little bit of historical context, we wanted to invite author Chris Yogerst onto the show. Hi, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Chris has literally written the book on Warner Brothers. It's called Warner Brothers. And I guess, so if we can, Chris, love to start with you. Give us some historical context of the role that Warner Brothers plays in the history of cinema and certainly in the current media environment, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it was an easy book to title because it was.
I was going to say, how did you come up with that title? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, it was real tricky.
Almost as easy as naming the company.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, they weren't the first in the pool, of course, but they did. I mean, just like Carl Laemmle and William Fox and a lot of these other people, they were up against. Thomas Edison, right? They were battling for their right to grow, in the late or the early 19-teens. But once they incorporated in 1923, I mean, they pretty quickly were able to establish themselves as a studio that was different than the other studios. And this was the studio that, of course, took the big leap to invest in sound and bring that to market, even though their version of sound ended up going away and we got sound on film instead, which was, of course, better. But once they established themselves as this major studio, they really prided themselves, and this came directly from the brothers, they really prided themselves on being the studio that spoke to the public. And instead of being an escapist studio, and we all need escapism right now, you needed it then, right? But I mean, they really prided themselves on licensing books that were really about the world as it was. They were making movies about the world as it was. I mean, even their musicals were like not happy. They were like hard hitting and gritty right? They're making the crime movies, the anti-Nazi movies. They were leading the charge during World War II. Had a few hiccups during the Cold War, but they really took on TV, even though Jack Warner didn't really want it. I mean, Bill Orr really took on the television wing of that company. And it really, from the beginning, it is evolved with the industry in really interesting ways. And it's a kind of a story of perseverance. Even after the brothers have been long gone, the studio, as it merged into Seven Arts, or where AT&T, whatever it's been, Discovery has been not the best, but it's here, right? It's still there, and it's for me, when I look back, all the way at least to the incorporation of 23. I mean, this is a story of survival, and of course, right now we're up against how is it going to survive in this current era, right? This tech takeover of Hollywood. They've been doing well with HBO, right? They have some streaming assets. So it's like, once again, here's this old legacy studio that is still has a foot in what's to come. And I feel like that's kind of been their trajectory this whole time.
Right. You touched on it a little bit, this idea, the early days and the Motion Picture Patents Corporation company. And so we have seen this industry be very condensed, with power concentrated in the hands of one company, one person, essentially. Ross, talk to us a little bit about how we arrived with this major, the multiple studios, and what became the studio system.
Well, that's a really long and complicated answer. We always think about all of the technology of the multinational corporations and the multimedia corporations of that period as something that happens in the post-war era, or the 80s or the 2000s or today. But this industry, which we think of as the film industry, has really been the entertainment industry since the 1920s. In that period, you have the merger of broadcasting, which radio, music publishing and recording, you have motion picture production, distribution, and exhibition. You have a huge number of intellectual property distribution channels, technologies like sound on film, sound on disc, radio broadcasting, music recording. All of these things are happening domestically that integrate all of these companies, through technology as well as consolidation. You also have the financialization practices, which grow exponentially. And begin with investment companies, investment banking companies. And so many of these companies become public. And so when they did that, that's what has opened up so much of the M&A, mergers and acquisitions activity that's been going on for 100 years, is that once they became well-heeled, publicly traded companies, they've opened themselves up to all of the various machinations that publicly traded companies do. And that has enabled that both public and private financing has enabled that growth internationally as well as domestically to create the studio system, which then, and I'll stop my answer there, which then created a difference between New York and Los Angeles, which is in the beginning, most of the business was on the East Coast. It was New York. That's where the finance sector was. That's where the exhibition distribution sector was. And then eventually you had just the studio out here on the West Coast. But in fact, over time, you have more studio system moving west, but you have so much of the power still located in New York, and that stayed true for much of the next 50 years, even after the 1920s and beyond. So the studio system, which we think about it, is this period where you have this group of families who take businesses public, which allows them to grow their technology, their distribution, their production and exhibition internationally, and then allows them to also grow into technology, and the technology built that system. And I think capping this conversation, or at least what I'm talking about in the 1920s, means that you're about to move into the next place where the same things you're seeing today, that there's a shift in the market, there's technological change, there's distribution practice change, there's all of these different changes, as well as the fight around monopoly power, around consolidation, around consumer changes and technological changes. All of that begins to coalesce right in the late 1920s, as you can imagine, right before the Depression.
Right. Is there, and this is, I guess, for either of you, is there a
historical parallel or the closest historical parallel to what we're looking at? I mean, in terms of, I'm aware of the fact is that people who are outside of our industry are saying, oh, hey, they're seeing a merger, and they're saying, oh, I like Netflix, and it's $82 billion, and you know, so what? You know, I'm trying to sort of, what's important to me with this conversation in my agenda as both as an actor and a filmmaker is trying to sort of put context into what does it mean for people who make films and who care about films and who are trying to sort of get their head around what's happening. So I guess I'm asking, is there a historical parallel to this moment, or the closest historical parallel?
I can give you one and
start with that one.
yeah, Chris, you go ahead.
I mean, look, this is not Metro merging with Goldwyn, you know, and you know, becoming MGM. If you want to go back, you know, to that period, but this is akin to Disney buying Fox, I think, arguably.
Well, and that's one thing I keep thinking about is like, because there was this article in the New York Times, I think this morning or yesterday, by Tim Wu, who's a great scholar of a legal scholar, and he's done a lot of stuff on antitrust. And he wrote a column just saying that Warner Brothers being bought out by any of these companies should be illegal based on the, what does he cite? The Clayton Act of 1914. But which sounds great and smart. But at the same time, I'm wondering if Disney purchasing Fox negates all of this. Like, has the FCC now been kneecapped in terms of any of this, because there's been a modern precedent set, right, that they can go back to and just say, oh, well, they were able to buy this, and you know, you can use whatever language to justify it, right? Like, you know, major studios, you know, taking on another's IP and, you know, doing whatever they want with it. So that's why I'm wondering if like there's a modern precedent that's been set, because like historically the FCC has always kind of ruled against, like when you look at the Golden Age, ruled against the studios, right? I mean, there's obviously the major 1948 decrees, which, right, the theaters had to divest theater chains. But also one of the things I put in one of my recent columns is there's all these smaller examples that are really interesting too. Like Harry Warner in the late 40s tried to buy a TV network, and he was doing it just to give extra life to his own movies. He even made a public case that said like, hey, I'm not trying to create a monopoly here. I just want an extra avenue for our studio's movies. And the FCC shut him down. They didn't let them buy this, you know, and it's like today, now we're talking about studios buying studios when Harry Warner in the late 40s couldn't buy one small TV network.
To say something that just to build on Chris's point, something that I haven't seen talked about a lot is the solution of the old consent decree that took place just a few years ago. And it was really a conversation about, oh, great, now studios can own theaters. It's we've gotten rid of the consent decree. That was the conversation that was. What it really was, deregulating, you know, vertical integration even more. I think even at the time, people understood that no studio head wanted to own theaters. In fact, I remember a few of the people being asked, a few studio heads were asked, does this mean you're going to want to start buying theaters? And I recall that the article just registered laughter. So the idea that the consent decree was dissolved to allow theaters to get in there, to allow it to happen, is a big deal. And if you go back to look at the relationship between, say, Paramount in 1929, or relationship of United Paramount Theaters and ABC in the 50s, we've had a lot of conversation between broadcasters and film companies, as well as exhibition and film, and also, you know, Viacom and Paramount. So this is that's why I say the great thing, hopefully, about this conversation that we're all having is that we have been here before. We're just in a very different place with this conversation, because there's the retrospective view of, does it look like Fox and Lowe's from 1929? Does it look like Seven Arts and Warner Brothers? Does it look like, you know, Warner Brothers buying First National with all these kinds of concentrations of power? Does it look like the deregulation of the 1980s? Or does it actually look like something that has to do more with AI and fighting with YouTube over market share and eyeballs and IP and future technologies? I think the interesting thing about the moment we're in is that we all could talk about the things that have come before us. Part of what's interesting about this moment is that we have both conversation about foreign money coming in if the Paramount hostile takeover happens, which is different. That's not very typical in conversations. And we have conversations about generative AI and IP and using libraries for user technologies. That's very typical. But there are also questions that I think people are guessing at that feel very different.
Having written the book on Warner Brothers and really understanding what Warner Brothers is, it's a studio, it's a cultural institution. It has an American identity. I guess my question is, what are they buying? What are they actually purchasing? Is it the library? Is it the patina of a essentially 100-year-old studio? Is it is it access to HBO? Is it just essentially we want more of the pie so we can be more powerful? What's really what's for sale, and what does it mean?
Right. So the question about what are they actually buying, and this is something that is right. We should know this, but it's not entirely clear. One of the things that I do like so far, anyway, and this is if we take people at their word, what I like so far about Netflix is that they've had their labor issues, but they haven't had the massive sweeping layoffs that Paramount has had. They haven't had, and of course Warner Brothers has had this as well. And I'm wondering if maybe Netflix can ground itself with a legacy studio in a way that, they already have. They've got money, they've got reach, they have all this stuff. So what is the next thing? And it could be prestige, right? There's prestige in this Hollywood institution. So that's something I think that would add. And also, I think I mentioned this in one of my columns over the weekend, is it just as a kind of an aside that, Netflix already owns the original 1923 Warner Brothers studio, right? They have an office at the Bronson lot, right? So it's like, well, they didn't tear that down.
And no, it's not a real estate deal. We can.
Right. Oh, absolutely, it's not.
There is real estate, but
there is real estate, and they can certainly use the production space, all of that. But I also wonder if, one of the things that comes up a lot with anytime Warner Brothers business moves an inch is that the classic film crowd kind of goes into conniptions, justifiably. Sure. Like, we don't want to lose TCM, right? I get it. I totally get it. But like Warner Brothers here, it's survived, right? All of these things. We still have TCM. I know there's been talk for years about moving TCM back to Burbank, or moving it to Burbank. But there's one thing I like the idea of, that with the public statements that Ted Sarandos has said, and he's mentioned Casablanca and he's mentioned Citizen Kane, right? Because the Warner Brothers has the RKO backlog. That there's something, and there's been some people that will take issue with him calling these franchises, and I totally get it. Like, yeah, no, these are classic one-offs, but there's something about the idea that maybe Netflix could be a launching point for golden age cinema to new audiences. And I think that could also add prestige, that you have this catalog. It's not just this 21st century experiment that turned out to be a good investment, but now you are broadcasting Hollywood history, and being able to have that and do something with it, I think matches Netflix, because Netflix in a way has also done the crowd-pleasing movies, but they've also taken some artistic risks, and they've allowed auteur filmmakers to do. No one else wanted to do Fincher's Mank, right? So it's like
Irishman, right? Yeah, that right. Yeah.
Right, yeah, this kind of stuff, right? So I think there is some credibility to when the Netflix CEO comes out and says something like, "We're pro filmmaker." You can argue the structure of it all. But they've done some things for major filmmakers that other studios haven't as much in recent years. So I think that's worth considering when we're trying to juggle the ramifications of all of this. I think that's something that gets lost in the talk of stock prices and all of this kind of stuff. But I think, and then HBO on top of that, you had mentioned, right, that also adds prestige. So being able to I think both Netflix and HBO have done some really great kind of prestige television, and I feel like I feel like that also lines up quite well. I mean, if you look at, I was just kind of brainstorming stuff earlier, and I was thinking, the White Lotus to the new Netflix show that I just watched, The Beast in Me, which I thought was pretty good. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you could see on HBO. So I think there's kind of there's an alignment, a cultural alignment with these two companies that seems to make sense on a certain level. But I also agree with, I'd interviewed at the end of last week, Jack Warner's grandson, who believes that Warner Brothers is still best as a standalone, which I can't argue against that. I mean, I think Warner Brothers had a pretty good year. I think they could keep pushing. But there's just something, and again, the news could change 10 times before this airs and after it airs, but right, I mean, there's something about the culture of both of these studios that seems to align in ways that intrigue me. And maybe it's just me trying to be an optimist, but and I'm sure it is. But at this point, I think going back to the original question of like, what are they buying? I think there are some genuine reasons why they might want this particular studio with its assets, because I think it aligns up with some of the stuff that they've been making in recent years.
Right. Well, before we address that, what are they buying? I mean, the other question mark would be, why are they buying? But I want to address one question, which is, why are they selling?
Right. Yeah, that's another question. I mean, I guess what I keep coming back to, it's just obviously this Discovery merger was kind of ill-advised. So I almost wonder if it's just because that didn't work out as planned. I don't know if they're just jumping ship because they don't want to try to align it at this point, and they would rather just, break off Discovery and then let someone else take the reins that has a better cash flow. I mean, that's as far as I understand it now, that's how I feel about it. But I mean, it could be a million other things.
So this is a company that's gone through, I mean, Warner Brothers, just in the past 20 years alone, 25 years alone, maybe it's 30 years. We're talking about merger with New Line, with Turner, with New Line Turner, with AOL, et cetera, and all these kinds of changes. What did that do to Warner Brothers, both in terms of their culture and I guess maybe in terms of also their balance sheet?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's an interesting shift here. I mean, when I was last thinking about this, I mean, Warner Brothers, even through the 90s, I mean, they've had these periods of maintaining the legacy of the studio where they're putting out really interesting movies that seem to speak to the audience of the moment. And I think even within all these mergers that they've been able to do that. But one of the things that I think is an interesting thing to consider right now is who's actually going to be running the studio? Is this going to be, and this was a question with Zaslav as well. It's like, are you going to bring in, this TV guy to run a movie studio, or are you going to bring in somebody? I mean, that's one of the other things that Netflix has been trying to sell themselves as, is like that they really love movies. And I go back to when Gulf and Western bought Paramount, and Charlie Bluedorn was smart enough to be like, all right, let's put Robert Evans in there because here's someone who knows movies. Like, we don't know movies. Let's put a movie person in there. And now, we've had these big movie studios bought up by these other companies for years, and we've seen differing results on the kinds of background the CEOs come in with, or the studio chiefs come in with. But now we're in a weird position because those were all like non-movie companies buying movie studios, and now we're in an era of movie studios buying movie studios. So then that's one thing that's been itching at me, is like, who's going to run this, right? Is this going to be someone with a movie background or an entertainment background that's going to take artistic risks, that's going to be able to be pro movie, pro theater, pro exhibition, all of this? Or is this going to be like a Wall Street kind of executive who's just looking for the balance sheet, and right, like we've seen with Paramount, right, with these two major mergers, or these two major companies merging, and all of a sudden now we don't need a whole lot of employees. Whereas Netflix has already addressed, and Zaslav has already addressed, this idea that we don't need to get rid of a lot of people. So that's intriguing as well. So it's why are they buying, to answer your question? I mean, if they are not looking to get rid of a lot of people and cut a lot of costs necessarily, they might actually be at this point looking at buying the cultural institution.
I mean, yeah, part of me is like, if I could get into a a place where I thought we actually had a Federal Trade Commission that was going to enforce antitrust laws and say, no, this is just outside the pale. We're not going to consider it. Who is the buyer? And at that point, does that almost force Warner Brothers to go back to the table and say, all right, we need to maximize shareholder value. I understand that. That's, absolutely a requirement as a CEO. But I'm going to have to do that on my own, not by just selling to the highest bidder, because there is no one out there that is going to buy us that is not creating, the kind of conglomeration and antitrust position. I'm not sure that, between Netflix and Paramount, we can start talking about what the differences are. But at the end of the day, you're still talking an amazing degree of conglomeration and accumulation of control.
But I might say, Greg, the one thing that's really interesting here, unique, is that I'm not so sure we're talking about quote unquote studios or entertainment companies buying entertainment companies with this acquisition. They are a tech company. And their thought process around buying Warner Brothers is, remember that IP that Netflix has is post 2000. When you think about the IP that Warner Brothers has, it's everlasting and goes back, of course, to the 1910s and 20s.
Right.
So they're buying the library. And again, they're buying IP as future uses as yet unknown because they are a tech company. So that's a difference between, say, Paramount, Skydance Paramount purchasing Warner Brothers versus Netflix, which is in a race as much as it is with its competitors, as it is in a war against its technology competitors, aka YouTube and Google. So they're purchasing something that's not just a set of assets, a huge entertainment conglomerate that has film and television. Remember that they're not thinking about taking all the legacy cable institutions the way that Paramount is. But it's also just a difference in how these companies may be thinking about that. And again, not to keep saying the word unprecedented or different, but it's slightly because what's different about this is that you have a company that is as a film and television streaming platform and content creator, aggregator that has a global footprint. But it's also that you're adding a massive library to it. But there is a conversation about what will happen in the future. And that's where you see exhibitors truly concerned and trade organizations like Cinema United understanding that Netflix has a different set of values when it comes to where content should be seen and how it should be.
They've said point blank, like, theatrical is not our business model. We don't care about theatrical. That's why essentially, for me, just emotionally and without knowing sort of all of the context that you provide, that both of you provide, is just that you have this extraordinary movie company that essentially is the epitome of sort of movies, going to movies in theaters, and they're, Casablanca, on down, and essentially it's being absorbed into a company that really has been intent on really leading with technology and getting people not to go to theaters, and they sort of cynically put, I feel Netflix cynically puts movies in theaters for a week so that they can sort of coax awards just to kind of meet the standard, and then they're out, to the chagrin of a lot of filmmakers and many wonderful films that really should be seen in theaters. Greg, what?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would love for you to respond to that. Not, just in terms of as a theater owner and the theater owner that you are.
Well, look, we play movies that are being distributed by Netflix when we're able to. Sometimes we're not given that option. And that's, I think something worth having a conversation about, especially when it comes to classic films. If you can't actually play Casablanca in a theater where it was meant to be seen because somebody makes the decision that we only want to show it to you on our platform, that's a huge cultural loss right there. But that being said, there are filmmakers that are able to force Netflix to provide a theatrical release for their films. And in many cases, we have a lot of people, coming to see those movies. It's strangely enough, this is probably one of the Netflix's biggest years in terms of theatrical, box office, which we have to guess at because they don't report figures. But they had a number one film during the summer with something that was already out on their platform with K-pop Demon Hunters. And a lot of people are seeing Frankenstein in movie theaters. I mean, you can't measure the national box office that the film is having because there are lots of theater companies that won't play the film, even though it had maybe a 21-day window. Window meaning the period from when theatrical starts until when it appears on the platform. So I think there were probably 3 weeks before it appeared on the platform where Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein was in movie theaters. And only just a couple theaters that first week, so the rest of the movie theaters had a 14-day window. We kept playing the film where we could. In many cases, we don't plan to play their films beyond when it appears on the platform, but where we could, we kept showing it, and people kept buying tickets. Because I think there is a level where the public recognizes this is something worth seeing in a movie theater. I don't want to see this, in a lesser quality environment. I'm going to make that case, and I want to. And then the question mark becomes, okay, well, why is it that the filmmaker needs to have the power in this conversation to insist on something like that? And what is the history of filmmakers really being able to force studios to do right by their film, or at some point, once they've given you the money to make their movie, you make the movie, but then you shut up?
I do think we are in a place, if I could just add that, there's a lot on the line here. I think the challenge has been, it's interesting that Netflix has not wanted to have streaming. And so one of the things people looked at when they were doing research on how people experience content is that the same people who go to theaters are the same people who stream films, right? That it's not either or. You don't,
exactly, right.
Right. I don't just stream films, I don't just go to theaters. People do both. And what's interesting is Netflix has taken a very specific tact, which is that we are a streaming platform. We think movie theaters and these environments is outdated. That's, and then, but they, as you say, they have the Paris, they have the Egyptian, they have the Bay. So they do where they need to do some prestige exhibition and to theater chains for usually 1 to 2 weeks. But they also have Stranger Things coming to theaters for its finale. So they are playing in this environment. But it's interesting, Sony has done this investment in Alma Drafthouse because part of what's interesting about the space is that there is a lot of research to say people want to go out and Netflix wants you to stay in. And so what the battle was almost 100 years ago around when everyone was buying was determining what got sent where and how people saw it and where they saw it. And that is still sort of the battle that's going on here now. That was the battle with Fox trying to buy Lowe's MGM. That was the battle with other of these moments. And I think what's interesting about this moment is it's going to have a huge impact, in part because I don't think people, the DGA, the WGA, I don't think people at Cinema United feel that if Netflix purchases Warner Brothers Discovery, that they're going to have the fidelity to theatrical that Warner currently does. And you think about the ecosystem, Fox more or less got wiped off the board as a place to sell your films, as a place to book if you're a theater chain or a independent theater owner. So that just makes you think about what is the larger effect on the ecosystem if a company that says moviegoing is outdated in terms of theatrical and we're going to put you more on the streaming platform, people already live in algorithmic bubbles.
Right. So and then it just feels like less of less again. I mean, that's what we keep sort of essentially pivoting into, which is,
right. Unless they want to commit to having a more kind of multivalent kind of ecosystem where Netflix says, we're a streaming company. We believe in that platform, but we now have, Warner Brothers, and that is a long tradition. We want to uphold that tradition. And in fact, we think it gives us opportunities as a company to do our distribution to theaters. We want to embrace that. But of course, we also think you will spend more of your time streaming, but we want to celebrate our filmmakers and our company and what we do. And it's interesting that I think they're hedging. I don't expect them to embrace theatrical distribution like Warner Brothers has, but they could surprise us. But I think to not think that this is going to have a major, social impact of this merger, I think would be not true.
Yeah, I mean, I just theatrical, shrinkage, and then, as you say, editorial taste replaced by algorithmic taste. I mean, that's what movie theaters provide for filmmakers and for actors. But essentially, it's a place to get discovered. Bubble up to, that's why every independent filmmaker submits to film festivals, so that you can sort of rise up to the top, because it's so hard in an algorithmic world where everything is flat. And essentially, if you're not watching a movie like that, you don't know about it, and if you don't have a marketing budget to compete with, a studio marketing budget, even on Instagram, you can't. Even there, you can't. Again, the landscape gets flattened, and we all suffer, as an audience, in terms of just variety and depth and breadth. Chris, going back to the what are they buying? Do you think that there's any sense that there would be for whichever party gets it? I mean, I guess at this point it's Paramount, as we're speaking today. I mean, it's Paramount or Netflix. Do you think that the weight of that would land in such a way that they might consider, I don't know, a bigger tent, so that it's not just sort of a narrowing of theatrical windows?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ross is exactly right that there's going to be seismic shifts. It's big, and there's a lot that is. What's the best way to put it? Whatever Netflix does, right? If Netflix ends up being able to acquire Warner Brothers, however they do that is going to set the tone for the future. So I think that. At this point, like I said, I've got some cautious optimism based on their rhetoric that because there's a lot of stuff that is probably good just to go. There's probably some Warner Brothers movies that might have been better just going right to streaming. So maybe there's a part of this that if they do really want the legacy and the prestige, that, I guess as Ross was talking, I was thinking of maybe what kind of devil's advocate here. Maybe they would, because as Greg pointed out, I mean, Netflix is putting movies into theaters, right? The windows are smaller, that we should lobby for bigger windows, of course, but maybe an alternative universe here with this acquisition would be that maybe not less movies get into movie theaters, but just the right movies get into movie theaters, and the stuff that your Hallmarky kind of seasonal Christmas movies can go right to the streaming platforms. But then the stuff that you really do want to see in the theaters from both of these companies is going to still go into the theaters, right? And I think that's a possibility, right? I think as I say all of that, I don't want to sound too ignorant, because right, there's a possibility that this is all talk, and that Netflix would acquire this and then just wipe theatrical, right? Like there's that elephant in the room too. There'd be a ton of pushback, right? But I still think at this point because they are saying things that give me some hope, we should hold them to that and keep bringing that up.
It's just like another Supreme Court nominee who basically faces
right.
No, I really support those things, and then of course they.
Do you think it's possible?
By the way, I'm going to say that Ross, just give me one.
Sure.
Movie theaters, at least many of them, will need more than just. I mean, Michael Mitchell O'Leary came out today with this quote from Cinema United about we need more than blockbusters to survive. Now, maybe there are movie theaters that can survive just on the blockbusters. It will change, could change the face of exhibition. But historically speaking, movie theaters have thrived because there are a variety of movies. And Warner Brothers was a key player in that. I mean, as MGM was releasing their, or Paramount was releasing their, escapist fare, you've got the Bette Davis women's pictures, from Warner Brothers, and crime thrillers, the great noir film. None of those were necessarily blockbuster pictures, but they provided the breadth that attracted a wider variety of people into movie theaters. And I think to say that look, let the consumer can decide. Am I going to, is this worth seeing in a movie theater, or am I just going to, wait for it to come out onto a platform? And they do. Until you have a situation where a company says, well, we kind of need to support our streaming platform this month, so we're not going to release the Bridget Jones, film into movie theaters on Valentine's Day. And it's a film that, did a lot of box office around the world, in many cases in countries where they, have to play in movie theaters before they go onto platforms, and, zero in the US because it wasn't available to see them. If you wanted to see the movie in a movie theater, you couldn't.
Right. Well, I have a follow-up
that you say often, Greg, which is just that you need, it really is about having enough films to show to bring people back. I mean, it's like, how do you
how well
if you got a big blockbuster that bombs, then like what else have you got?
On that note, how well so if Netflix is buying all this IP, when any range of studios does these re-releases of classic movies, and we can say classic is anything 20th century at this point, sadly.
Hey, Pretty in Pink is coming, it's coming back to movie theaters.
How well do those do for you guys? I mean, like, is that something that, like, if Netflix had all of this, they could then, all this IP they own, could they just, where they don't have to like remake the movie, there's no production budget, because they just, re-release, Harrison Ford in The Fugitive, let's go see it again. Like, how well does that kind of stuff do? Or when they do Casablanca, when they bring that back?
Right. Well, we had several films this year that did a significant amount of box office, as reissues. I think the 50th anniversary of Jaws, attracted a lot of people to movie theaters, arguably one of the top grossing films that weekend. And a couple other films. Now, maybe that's within the context of, a down year or a down period at the box office when you could rush those things in. Not rush, but, predict in advance that there was going to be some opportunity. But people loved seeing those movies in a movie theater. And again, if there is a company that is fundamentally opposed to supporting theatrical and making their films and entertainment available in that environment, that goes away. That's, and I'm not judging them on their words. I'm going to judge them on their past actions, at least to some. I think we should, to some degree. Ross, it did come up. Longer windows. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the environment is in other parts of the world? And granted, the USA is never going to be France. I understand that, but maybe people do need to understand a little bit about what is required in some other countries.
What's required of distribution, or what's required of like?
Yeah, in terms of theatrical distribution before streaming.
There are so many.
This is not. I'm not necessarily an expert on this stuff, but
yeah, this is it's more to the point that there are so many different platforms. Netflix is not in every platform, not in every country. Neither is Amazon. Is Warner Brothers Discovery, but they're global. I think what's interesting that Netflix has really done is that they've built on what Sony used to be really great at and still is, which is local language production. Netflix has been genius about creating local language production, local production, understanding the local environment, building studios, leasing studios, cultivating talent, whether it's in the Middle East or South Asia, or whether it's in South America. They have understood that Netflix, to be global, needs to be local. And that's something that Sony has done really well and other companies have done well, but Netflix has really excelled at doing that and understanding its place in kind of inculcating culture and industry. And there's a lot of that going on all around the world. So while there is definitely a moment for Barbie and Super Mario Brothers and, Zootopia 2, which was huge in China, it's also that this is a moment where there are massive Chinese box office hits, always massive Bollywood, Tollywood hits. And so local industry is growing. And in fact, what Netflix has also done really well is understand the importance of South Korea and many other markets around the world in terms of bringing in content. Up until the 2000s or 2010s, Hollywood was still in many markets rather dominant. That really is very different post 2020, post COVID. And so Netflix has understood that that model is different. And the other thing I was going to say regarding the conversation you were having just a second ago, Greg, is that it's been a game in some cases where the film industry and the film exhibition industry are increasingly divergent in terms of the business that they run. That relationship, in my opinion, you would know better than me, but that relationship used to be much more symbiotic. It's been much more fractured and fragmented. Going back to Disney and other companies talking about changing windows, merging divisions, changing the way platforms work, streaming windows, SVOD, all of that. And so I think what may happen is that chains and theaters will need new models, new ideas, because people will want to still go to the theaters. Absolutely. But might be an opportunity to say just what you were saying, which is that man and woman cannot live on blockbusters alone. We're already seeing that. We're seeing that with lots of classic titles playing again. We're seeing that with a lot of audience behavior. There are just so many different things that can happen. I just don't think it's going to be business as usual. And with one more massive studio distributor off the board, I think it's possibly a moment to say, what else can we be doing here? If you have one player that doesn't really care anymore about windows and about distribution, you have more time to talk about the people who still. What's going to happen is we're still going to have these thermonuclear box office successes. Coming up next year is The Odyssey and so many others. And the question is just, will people who are really living on streaming not want some of that money? And I would suspect if you are a tech company, that's not your business. But if you're in the entertainment business, that is. And that's why it's a different kind of calculation when your calculation is not about thinking about your overall box office revenue, but thinking about shareholders, IP, technology, platforms, financialization, globalization. It's so when you're thinking about the global picture, it's again, just like it was in the 20s. And we're going to see a lot of impact from this. The kind of the roots and branches of this decision, however it goes, is going to be felt for possibly decades.
The thing that I would hope is that Ted Sarandos would perhaps, with seeing the breadth, assuming that it went to Netflix, that he could say, you know what, we have been a tech company, but now we are at a place where we can sort of expand our vision and understand that it doesn't have to be either or. Clearly, they're a giant studio at this point, and perhaps even with the most money, although Paramount obviously has a lot of money, but that's because of Skydance. But in this case, they have the ability to be able to potentially grow with this acquisition if that were to happen, and then reimagine,
evolve
their very sort of narrow business practice. That would be my
This is where I get my optimism a little bit. If it goes exactly as you're saying, like that's why I say like grounding themselves in a legacy studio, because it's like they have the streaming, but if they can add to that with this other model and use both, right. I mean, that everybody should win in that situation, in theory.
Because then it's not either or, because it's just been right. It's been so or and not either, that it hasn't been an opportunity for high tide to raise all boats. You know what I mean? That's what I hope for in the best possible scenario. In the worst possible scenario, I think why everyone from Jane Fonda to the Directors Guild to even the Teamsters are screaming, which is just, oh no, this is all going to fall into a black hole of a very small, narrow Netflix button, and that the thing that we love about movies, namely going to theaters, it goes away because that's not their business model. So that's the big $24 question for me in terms of how this plays.
I mean, it's interesting because in the end of the 1920s, the biggest theater owner, and thus therefore you would say dominant company, was Paramount. Massive amount of theaters. That was a huge problem for them in Depression. That's why they filed for bankruptcy reorganization. The smallest number of theaters was Lowe's. In fact, the only one of the 5 that made money every year of the 1930s, because they had MGM and because they had low overhead. Over time, all of these companies are in a marathon. And so you can't see down the road what decisions you're making today can put you in a vulnerable position tomorrow. But we can never foresee necessarily what's there. And I think one thing that has been there for 125 years has been, I buy a ticket, I go to the movies. And so the question of whether or not that is not still a value might still be one. And I would hope that when they're creating that calculation, if they should prevail, that they will think about the fact that the consumer demands to go to the movies and to see movies at home, and that they all can provide an ecosystem and value to the brands and IP that they're trying to expand upon. And that the either or that's been a conversation in the last decade could also really withstand a little nuance when right. Mostly in the other.
Well, I guess the next question then is if Paramount gets this, and then you have is that a sort of a Disney Fox situation again, where you have, one fish eating another fish, and then you just have less fish. I mean, I guess that's the case either way. But what is that?
I don't think there's any question that after the Disney Fox merger, there were fewer films being released by the combined company than what you had individually, which means not only fewer movies for movie theaters to show, it's fewer movies that consumers can buy tickets to, and it's fewer movies that filmmakers are getting made, which means fewer people working.
Right. So is that the case whether it's Paramount or Netflix? Is that the case either way?
Well, the reports all say that it's Paramount that is talking about workplace efficiencies, aka layoffs. Netflix
they've done that recently too. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean,
people. Yeah. Right.
Right. So the idea used to be that you would combine all these things, right? So you could only have one distribution company. You could create efficiencies, which mean a lot of layoffs. Netflix is not talking about that. We don't really know. We don't know if Paramount were to acquire it, whether the Warner Brothers would continue exactly as it is. If you think back to Fox, when they had a lot of debt, and all these companies, no matter who it is, they're all loaded up with debt. One of the ways people got rid of debt was selling real estate. What's better real estate than studios? And that's the other thing we don't talk about much, which is that all of these companies own an incredible amount of very valuable real estate.
Chris, you've spent a lot of time not with Harry and Jack, but certainly in their heads and in their letters and in their thoughts. What would they say?
Well, the more I think about the Netflix thing, the more I see some alignment with Harry, just in terms of the kinds of content, right? I really what was, and this was Sam, Albert, Jack as well, even though Jack was the one who kind of threw everybody under the bus in the 50s. They were all really, really proud of the kinds of movies that they made and the type of impact that the studio had. And I think that what they would likely be most interested in a scenario like this in these days, especially in this polarized era, is, who is going to continue that? And even after Warner Brothers initially sold and Jack was still at just running the studio, I mean, he was still greenlighting these kinds of movies. And, we get A Face in the Crowd, and we get The Searchers, and we get some of these really, really important movies. And so I feel like they, and then I can even see somebody like Sam. I mean, he was the one who was so obsessed with technology. There's a piece of that where I feel like he would be very intrigued with how Netflix and Warner's could partner and kind of everybody wins situation, because they were, they were very much about exploring all options and not afraid to look to the future, even if it might change things. So I feel like, and again, I know I'm hearing myself, and I feel like someone's going to watch this and be like, you are way too optimistic. But I just, that was just the Warner Brothers prevailed in some really incredible ways when they probably shouldn't have. And I just, if that story holds, the opportunity for that is here. That doesn't mean it's going to be there. All the guilds that have concerns about labor, that's all very, very justified, right? Because so many things can happen, and they all need to also continue voicing. Theater owners need to continue voicing. I mean, all of this stuff needs to be on the table. But one thing that I tell my students a lot is that movies were supposed to have died like 1 million times, right? They were, it was, Nickelodeons were just a fad, right? And then sound came in, and it was going to be over. Television came in, it was going to be over. Home video was going to kill it. The internet definitely was going to kill it. Yet here we are still talking about it, right? So I feel like there's the history pulls at me that, and I feel like that's what gives me some of this seemingly strange optimism sometimes, because it's like movies just find a way to prevail, even when they're not supposed to. Right? Barbie wasn't supposed to make $1 billion, right? Like, so and I know you can't live on blockbusters alone, but right, like there are all these exceptions, right? There's all the scary stuff, and then there's always a but then there was this thing. So I feel like going back to the Warner Brothers themselves, I feel like they'd be very intrigued with this, and I also feel like they would not. When I've spoken to the family members, descendants of the Warner Brothers, and they do not like the Paramount Skydance option at all. So there's that.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You did mention, people who are weighing in on this, what impact it's going to have, I don't know. But for people who are watching this and thinking about where their position is, certainly there's no harm in writing to your congressman, writing to, whatever regulatory agencies are having a look at this. I think people, these are our elected representatives, and they need to hear from us and hear what our opinions are. And that's certainly one place that consumers can at least try to make their voices heard.
And that is the reason the Fox-Lowe's merger did not happen in 1929, because there was, not just because of and Chris wrote very beautifully about this recently in the Hollywood Reporter, which is it's not just because of the William Fox accident and the amount of debt. It was also that there was a push by Louis B. Mayer out of the deal to go to his friend Herbert Hoover and ask for that deal to be squelched. And it was facing a lot of challenging during a Republican administration in Washington, which was not very excited about that deal. So there's a great tradition of all of these massive mergers that have happened over the last 100+ years that have really been sprinkled with some of the conversation we're having today, including that one, which would have completely changed the business. It would have put Fox on a much bigger footing and on par with Paramount. I think what you have today is Netflix will be, as people were talking, really unassailable in terms of platform. But it was also that there were people who were pushing both on the local as well as the industry level against a deal that they thought was very challenging and might do a lot of job losses and concentrations of power.
Yeah. I mean, there are the massive job losses. There's the consolidation. We're also at a sort of a fragile moment with AI, and everyone I know, that is all the creative people I know, are concerned about what that might mean for whatever form of activity that they are within the film or television world. Will they be replaced, or is there a world where they won't be needed? But the thing, of course, the place that this hits is just in the we want to keep doing what we love doing. We want to keep creating. We want to keep telling stories. We want to keep making movies and collaborating with other people. We want opportunities to do it. Yes, we want to be in theaters. Of course, there's streaming. That's not ever going to go away. And ideally, in a world, there will be more opportunities to continue to do what we all love. And so, we're all a little edgy. Obviously, there's a politician at the top who clearly has an agenda, which also makes it feel particularly uncomfortable at times. But it has, just from a creative person in the business, this has sort of hit a kind of a nerve, because there's just generally so much uncertainty, not just in the world, but now particularly in our business, and so Chris, I'm going to hold on to your sort of at least positive thoughts, and hopefully that wise minds will prevail, and they'll say, movie theaters continue to bring in, enormous money, and they're huge opportunities to sort of discover new talent and to sort of be a place for people to kind of explore, different ideas, and that independent cinema is the lifeblood of what we do, because it just is. And how do you do that if you're stuck in a, behind an algorithmic wall? So anyway, I truly hope that there's an opportunity for us to keep just doing what we're doing, and that this is an adjustment. But that all the opportunities can and may open up in ways that we don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, look, Chris, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure getting to talk to you. Ross, always great to have you back.
Thank you.
I guess this is a conversation that, we might be back here in a couple more weeks talking about what actually happened. But it really felt like it's something to at least start trying to wrap our heads around and get an understanding. And I hope that we've provided you, the viewers, with at least some historical context with which to have this conversation. So thank you for joining us again, Chris and Ross, and thank you to our subscribers and listeners and watchers. And I hope you'll join us again on Inside the Art House.
This episode of Inside the Art House was produced by Wishing Well Entertainment and Raphael Sparge, with on-site production by Naryn Dickerson. Our supervising producers are Thomas Cassetta and Miles McCreary. The episode was edited by Rick Pratt, with sound mixing by Thomas Cassetta. Our musical theme was composed by Isabel Engman and Gerardo Garcia Jr., graphics by Jenna DeAngelis, and social media marketing and web design by Stephanie Peters. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. See you next time on Inside the Art House.